Hello and welcome to another edition of the Time for Impact podcast with myself, Chris Wade, and my co-host.
Hi, everyone. Matt Cobble here.
Brilliant. Hi, Matt. Good to see you. As always, we try to bring on the podcast things which are pushing the innovation and the creativity levels around volunteer management and volunteer involvement as best we can. Sometimes we have the opportunities to bring things which are hot off the press. Um, and today is definitely an example of that. And we're delighted to be joined by my fellow consultant, Gethyn Williams. Hi, Gethyn. How are you?
Oh, hi, Chris. I'm good, thank you, and delighted to be here. Thanks so much for having me. And hello, Matt.
Brilliant. Thanks for coming along. Now, Gethyn, some of you will already know, but Gethyn has just released, along with AVM and Team Kinetic, a toolkit to help us all grapple with those challenges that we have in terms of moving into a more digital focused world in volunteering as us as human centered volunteering professionals. Sometimes we find it a little bit more tricky both to move into that digital involvement well, but also to get the ownership and the buy-in of our colleagues and our leaders in that. So Gethyn's produced something that will hopefully help us all navigate that challenge. But I'm probably saying too much already, Gethyn. So I will let you perhaps introduce yourself to everybody listening, and perhaps give us a bit of an introduction into what the toolkit is and how it came about.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, sure, happy to. And hello, everyone. Thank you for listening to this. I'm Gethyn Williams. I'm as Chris said, a consultant who specialises mainly in volunteering. There are a number of us about. We've all got similar histories, I think. I don't think mine's particularly unusual. Worked in the voluntary sector a long time. Loved volunteering, and when I went freelance, it felt like a natural thing to do. So lucky enough to work with some brilliant people in a brilliant area of voluntary activity. But yeah, I'm here to talk about the toolkit mainly. Digital in Volunteering Toolkit, a new resource that I've been, that I've, I suppose, designed and written and put together in consultation with other colleagues, but was kind of commissioned through our good friend Chris Martin at Team Kinetic, and designed and developed with the help of the membership of the Association for Volunteer Managers, AVM. As you said, so it's very much sort of a team effort. As you said, Chris, in the intro, digital is one of these kind of interesting areas of activity. We've got this very relational industry that we're in. It's very, very dependent on people and relationships. And yet, digital offers us so many tools to help us do volunteer management, volunteer engagement better, well, effectively. When used in the right place, I suppose. And over the last 20 years or so, which is about the time that Team Kinetic's been going, and I think this was what Chris's insight for sort of starting this project. I guess we've noticed a real proliferation of digital options for us in volunteering. Loads of different systems and platforms out there, endless tools that you can use, and yet, we're still in a very challenging time for volunteering. It hasn't solved all of our problems. So, given that we're working in this really challenging period, we thought, how can we help people use digital in the best way possible for them and just adopt what's necessary for them? And we started talking to volunteer managers and leaders in volunteering. And they all said very similar things. They said things like, well, I'd like to use digital more, but I'm struggling to break out of Excel. I'm sort of stuck in a spreadsheet. Or I'm kind of aware of what some of my colleagues are doing or what some national charities are doing, but and I feel like I should be adopting those sorts of things, but I don't really know what it is or kind of where to start. And to be honest, the last thing I want to do is pick up the phone to someone like Team Kinetic or any of the other platforms and have a conversation with them, because I might be bamboozled by choice and technicals. So rather than put together a toolkit that had kind of everything that was new and current in digital language made by digital evangelists, we thought, let's try and give the volunteering sector a resource to help them adopt digital on their own terms, slightly more entry level, slightly more human language, and written from the point of view of people who do volunteer engagement rather than people who are tech evangelists. And that's what the toolkit's all about.
Yeah, and it's kind of it's a great resource to have, and it just got me reflecting, Gethyn, that you and I have been around in the sector a little while now, as Matt. When I first commissioned probably my first volunteer management system, I think the choices available to me and to my colleagues were sparse, to say the least. And I
Yeah,
remember
I
having a
bet.
conversation with an IT consultant myself, saying, "Well, maybe we should set something up here because I think probably there was better impact and not a lot
Right.
else." As I remember, old Salesforce products. But in the last 10, 15 years, there has been quite a proliferation
Mm.
of solutions, and they're moving quite fast now, aren't they? So hopefully you developed a tool that, and I should say they've also got a lot cheaper in my experience as well as
Right.
solutions.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think more and more of our colleagues are perhaps moving into that world, or at least thinking they can move into that world. And I think it's good to have a tool that enables them to cut through that and find the solution that works for them.
Yeah, yeah, that's what it's about. It's about how to approach digital, really. And yes, the danger is that the whole thing's out of date as soon as you release it. So so we've broken it up into several stages, and some of it is quite foundational, and hopefully will be quite timeless or last for a while. And some of it will be a bit more specific to kind of what's going on now. But maybe we'll talk about that as we go.
I noticed you got this, your typical sort of Moscow kind of framework, which is a really nice way. I mean, you can tell people how that works, but a way of sort of identifying what you as an organization need from a solution, rather than getting bogged down into all digital solutions, actually working out what it is that you're trying to achieve through a system in the first place. Do you want to tell us a bit
Yeah.
about that?
Well, I mean, it reflects what we heard a lot when we were developing this, and we took quite a while to develop it. It's been the product of a sort of a year to 18 months worth of thinking, really. And I guess we heard that a lot of volunteer managers didn't know what they didn't know, had an inkling for kind of what they wanted, and maybe less about what they didn't want. So Moscow is one of the tools that we use to help people kind of approach these things, and it's not the only one really. There's there's quite a lot of practice that I think is increasingly becoming mainstream in volunteering world that comes from digital and tech. If you think about user journeys or obsessing about user experience and those kind of
Mhm,
things,
mhm.
or even developing personas for volunteering, which a lot of us do these days. A lot of this stuff comes from a marketing place, or a digital or a tech world or something like that, and it's kind of creeping into volunteering. So it's not necessarily about the tools and the platforms that you use, but the approaches that you use to get to them. And once we felt that once we feel a bit more confident in the approaches, then the right tech solutions start to reveal themselves, or you get a lot more confident about knowing what you're asking for. We've released the first part of the toolkit last week, and our hope is that it's something that can take a volunteer leader or a manager to the point at which they have a viable plan for what they want to do with digital on their
Mm,
program, and
mm.
they feel confident to take it back into their organization and kind of lead that with authority, or be able to kind of hold their own in a conversation with a
Yeah,
software
yeah, yeah, yeah.
developer, which is which like you, I've had that personal terror a little bit as well, where you sort of there's an imbalance of knowledge and you're not quite sure where it's going.
Yeah, and you've broken the whole journey down into sort of 5 stages, as I understand it, as I read it. Becoming, well, you can talk them through, but becoming digitally confident, understanding what your vision is for your volunteering team in the digital world, as I understood it. That user interface, in user journey, user satisfaction part, um, pitching for investment, selling it to those who've got control of the purse strings, and then
Yeah,
your
exactly.
organisation journeys. So I thought that was really useful. I don't know if you want to sort of talk us through that or.
I mean, you've done a brilliant job of the headlines, to be honest, Chris. But you're absolutely right. So this is part one of the toolkit. It's a series of fairly short, reflective exercises, kind of diagnostic exercises, and those sorts of things. And like I said, the point of this part one, is to get you to the point where you've got a bit of a plan for what you want from digital. And there are four main elements, we call them, in the toolkit to get you there. The first one is around getting confident with digital language and options, and that takes you through a bit of a dummy exercise about choosing your ideal volunteer management software platform. So we give you a big list of options, and you use Moscow, as you said, must have, should have, could have, won't have, to decide whether you want these things or not, or whether they feel like they offer some use for you. We kind of give you an option on the spreadsheet template that you get with it to kind of cross-reference those things against vision for volunteering themes as well. So if you're kind of coming to reimagining your program from a slightly different viewpoint, you can think about, well, what themes are most important to me, and how does that relate to the tools I want? So we get you to do a sort of dummy exercise, and actually which volunteer management platform is right for me was overwhelmingly the most common question we were told by volunteer managers that they had about digital. So we thought that's a great starting point. Developing the vision, the second element, is all about, again, we sort of borrowed an approach from the tech industry. We noticed that lots of digital innovations seem to do with one of three things: scale, efficiency, or experience. People are either trying to use digital to grow something, usually an audience, or to improve their processes, efficiency. So that feels for us like it's more about the volunteer manager trying to streamline the journey, save themselves time, reduce duplication of stages, all that stuff. Or it's about experience, the experience of the volunteer, and user experience kind of comes into that a bit later on. So we give you scale, experience, and efficiency, and we try and get you to narrow down your preferences within that kind of framework. And again, it just gets you into a bit of digital headspace. The third part is mapping a user journey, a foundational sort of project, or a foundational tool for most digital projects really is to understand the journey the customer goes on. So, many of us have done versions of that already, but if you haven't, this is a really great starting point. And the fourth one was my favorite, as you said. It's pitching. Who do you have to convince to take with you? Lots of volunteer managers told us that it wasn't, for them, this challenge wasn't just about knowing what they needed to know about digital. It was about who they needed to convince. Sometimes that's about authority and permission. Can I go and develop this further? Can I go and explore this? Sometimes it's about money. So we talked to lots of volunteer managers and got a range of people they needed to convince, from senior managers to trustees to external funders. And we noticed that they all like to hear different things, and they use different arguments with them. So we've boiled all of that down. So again, you've got some of the language that might appeal to these audiences there. And those are the four main tasks, really. And then if you do all of those and you get to element 5 of the toolkit, then you can put all of that together into a bit of a plan. And it's it's not an elaborate plan; it's a roadmap. But the learning outcomes from this part, I think, are about confidence and motivation to start on digital. We wanted to kind of help get people over that hump a little bit. So that's what it's for.
Yeah.
I thought one of the really interesting things about the toolkit, probably for a volunteer manager or someone working in a volunteering team, is like how much of this stuff they're probably doing already. And actually a lot of this is about how you can apply that stuff to a digital project or to a digital challenge you've got. And I suppose, I think it's exciting, and my feeling is people should really draw confidence from this, because many of us, in the volunteering world at the moment, we're people, right? But we're sometimes perhaps less confident with running what can feel like very big, intimidating digital projects. This gives me confidence to go, actually, I'm doing lots of this already. So here's some things, here's some tweaks, or here's some add-ons. But the sort of the basis of this is stuff that I think, that I'm feeling quite confident in, and and that I've already given some thought to. I wondered if you've had any feedback, or if you've heard of others kind of applying some of this stuff and how it's gone down.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, absolutely. The thing about digital is you're right; it's integrated into our lives whether we like it or not, really, isn't it? And we probably don't realise to a large degree, and maybe that's kind of behind your insight that like a lot of this feels like things that we already have some familiarity with, and I think that's a good thing. I think a lot of the volunteer managers I know end up being jack of all trades. many of them kind of gravitate into these roles because they have natural affinities for people, and they're kind of really good at it. And I think you sort of have to pick up quite a lot of wider knowledge that enables you to help you do your role really well. And digital's kind of like part of that, I guess. One of the things we tried to do in part one was include an awful lot of, not necessarily all full case studies. There are a few case studies in there, but there's quite a lot of, this is what other volunteer managers have done, or this is what other volunteer managers have tried. And I think we all take confidence from that, don't we? I look to my peers for all sorts of things in that space. So part one is probably designed for people who are either at the start of their digital journey and may well know more than they think they do, but need to kind of consolidate that in some way. Or maybe it's for people who feel fairly comfortable about digital, but just want to sort of take a step back before they refresh their approach. I think really, like, it kind of works on that level as well. Maybe some of the people that you're thinking of that kind of, have already made a bit of a start, or so have already got a volunteer management software platform, or they're already using digital to reach and find new volunteers, or perhaps communicate with them. They might get a little bit more out of part two that's coming next year.
Yeah.
So part two is less foundational exercises, and it's more current use cases of digital in volunteering. So we've taken sort of 7 or 8 or so real world examples of how people are using digital in volunteering right now, and unpack that a little bit more. So for people that are maybe slightly down this road already, that might be the part of the toolkit that makes a little bit more sense.
It does make sense, and we'll come on to some of that, I'm sure, in a second as well. I often speak to volunteering professionals who get this actually quite well, but to point, I think it's 4 of your current little toolkit, they struggle to explain that in a sort of culturally intelligent way to those with either the external funders or their leaders of the organisation, and even using the toolkit to demonstrate the vision, to demonstrate the choices of whether I'm going to focus most of my effort, or the important things to me are the onboarding and the application process, or whether it's actually about the management, or whether it's actually about the communication. They probably know all this, but by having a format that allows them to articulate that to others, I suggest might be really helpful even before you get to the pitching stage, because actually it provides, if you like, a corporate, more professional looking template that sort of spells out the argument that's needed. So I think there's some real value in having a template like that. I think will be quite useful, because one of the trickiest things, not just in digital but in volunteer management full stop, is often convincing the rest of the organisation, whether they be leaders or colleagues, the importance, the intricacies, the complications that sit with volunteering. And I think actually that will help spell out the business case. And I guess the one thing which I wondered what wasn't there, and maybe it's in part 2 and 3 that to follow next year, is the people, the one group that weren't really spelt out in terms of having to convince of all this were the volunteers themselves.
The volunteers themselves,
and actually taking volunteers on the journey to understand that they, there's benefit in going into this digital world. It'll make their life easier, faster, more interesting, more collaborative, whatever it might be, would be another really interesting kind of component going forward, I wondered. Because most of these things, if they fail, they don't fail because of technology, they fail because of the people failing to adopt the technology, you might experience.
Exactly.
It's that buy-in part, isn't it?
No, true. And no, you're absolutely right. Taking all sorts of different people with you was a big lesson of part 1 for us. The voice of the volunteers does come through in individual sections, or the needs around that. But you're right, that it isn't kind of pulled together in one particular element. So, for example, there's a case study in there from the Ramblers, I think, where they had a job to do to bring their volunteers with them and use the app and the new platform, and they had to sort of find the right use case for them. There's stuff in part 1 around volunteers who are, digitally excluded, or just not digital natives, or suffering from some sort of barrier around digital. Sometimes that's cultural. I just no, thank you. That's not how I do volunteering. And sometimes it's a bit more technical. But lots of organisations have created sort of digital champions roles, or to help people kind of get to grips with digital, or perhaps asked volunteers to buddy other volunteers where they have some digital knowledge. There's some nice examples of that. So there are some options for you to help take people with you. But I think you're right, and this is this is nothing to do with the technology itself, but it's about finding the right use case, isn't it? And it's finding the thing that really appeals to you. I tell this story, and I did as part of putting this toolkit together several times when we were presenting it to people, about how my dad just resisted email for years and years and years, and would ring me up, and I'd be on the phone for sort of 50 minutes with him trying to do something online for him while he's telling me what I need to know, and it's so painful and exhausting. Eventually he had grandkids, not mine, my brother's, and realized that if he only had FaceTime or something like that, he could see them and talk to them every day, kind of better than a phone. And it was that realization that made him want to get an email address. And sometimes you just need to find that kind of one thing that makes a genuine, tangible difference to your life, and that unlocks, that's the tipping point. So there is stuff in this toolkit that sort of helps you to think about digital in that way, rather than says, this is really shiny and exciting and new, and we should all go and have a look at it.
Yeah, and volunteer managers are usually pretty good at that anyway. That usually comes natural, doesn't it?
Yeah, they know their volunteers.
And on that note, it also emphasizes why being clear about what you're trying to do is so important, right? Like, is it about efficiency? Is it about scale? Is it about experience? And sometimes those things will be in conflict with each other. So, for some people, driving up the efficiency might damage the experience for others, particularly those who volunteering, that digital is not a fundamental component of their volunteering experience, right? But it still builds into that case for support. And I think that's probably important for those of us that are embarking on these digital projects, isn't it? Particularly almost at that pitch stage, that buy-in stage, about being realistic about what it means to deliver a digital project like this, and not just how it's going to make things better, but the commitment also required to deliver the change, right, is to me also, or at least in my experience, has been as fundamental as where you're going to get to. Sometimes getting to that destination can be a bit bumpy along the way, but it will be worth it at the end.
Engaging with volunteers and managing volunteers is such a relational skill anyway, isn't it? So there's stuff in this toolkit that tries to apply those kinds of natural stakeholder management skills, I guess, that volunteer managers might naturally have had, to other parts of the organization. This felt obvious when people were saying it to us, but it kind of hadn't occurred as a fully formed thought. But directors and senior managers will be managing more people than just you. They've probably got an overview of different parts of the organization. Your priorities aren't their only priorities. So how are you going to relate what you really want for your program, or what you think you can achieve, to some of those wider aspects of the organization? Are your volunteers part of a wider customer journey at all? Our colleague Helen Timbrell's examples from the National Trust always come to mind when I think about customer journeys, because you get people visiting National Trust properties and then becoming a member, and then maybe becoming a volunteer, and maybe donating. There's a clear customer journey there for them. There are probably versions of that in lots of our organisations. Some volunteers also use services. They may volunteer in multiple ways, which might take them into different parts. So if you're talking to a director, how can you reflect what you want to do to all of these different challenges? And equally, if you've got a trustee in front of you, if the AGM's come up and you're taking the opportunity to try and lobby them or something, think about what they're interested in. And what colleagues told us was, trustees need to manage risk. So they're probably thinking about organisation-wide health and safety, safeguarding, data protection, key things that come into volunteering. How does more digital tools help you to manage that better, and to pick up on training when it's needs refreshing, and do reporting with credibility, and those sorts of things. So often, I think you're absolutely right, Matt. Scale, efficiency, experience. You could almost start anywhere, but you may want to highlight different aspects depending on kind of which audience you're talking to.
I think it's really intriguing sometimes, at least it's taking away from the toolkit a bit, probably, Gethyn, but that you and I and others will advocate for quite often for a volunteer management system, rather than, certainly rather than volunteers using the HR system or some other system to manage that data. And that's absolutely right. But increasingly, as we move into the world of sort of more flexible volunteering, and the boundaries, what you said really kind of made me think about it, the boundaries between participation, volunteering, donating maybe, become much, especially as we do more sort of ad hoc volunteering, become a little less obvious. And I wonder, in terms of the iteration of future volunteer management systems, we
Mm,
need to kind of grapple with that, because the audience that is, part of community fundraising, for instance, could easily be sitting in the sort of donating world of fundraising, or they could be sitting in the participation world of volunteering. And I mean, I think we get around that by having a sort of data management warehouse kind of technique where the two systems plug into. But I suppose increasingly those two worlds are going to start to intersect. And it'd be interesting how that starts to develop. But it does push us to work much closer with our colleagues in other departments in devising and identifying the needs of our systems in a more
mm.
joined up and holistic way of thinking, I guess, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think you've touched on something really interesting there, actually, because it's sort of a good reminder for all of us that you know, no matter how good the platform that you choose, it's probably not going to do everything that you need it to, and it might need to relate to other systems and platforms as well. So
Mm.
connectivity and interoperability is a question to ask yourself when you go down this road. There's stuff about that in part two of the toolkit that's coming up, but you're right. It's kind of internal and external, and I've been in very well known charities with good volunteering operations where they've kind of tried to crowbar you into using a completely different CMS that's built for fundraising purposes or something
Yeah.
separate for managing volunteers. And you're right, it kind of doesn't do everything. So you're probably always going to have a version of this challenge. No matter what you land on, it's going to need to talk to other systems or connect at some point. That's part of the reason why kind of mapping out your approach to digital and doing it in stages and being quite generous with the time you give yourself for it is probably so important. And that's a big lesson of part one. Um, but the other angle on that, I suppose, is that it's not just internal connections; it's external as well. And we've been fortunate enough to have some really good national case studies in the last few years around times when better connection of everyone's platforms would probably be to everyone's benefit, organizations as well as volunteers themselves. COVID's the obvious one.
Mm.
If we'd had a world where digital seamlessly talked to each other, we perhaps could have organized that even more effectively. Although, to be fair, I think local areas did a brilliant job in the main. But the other one that comes to mind for me is the Big Help Out, which is a campaign designed to stimulate volunteering from a national level. But within that, what you really want to do is drive that audience to the volunteering opportunity that's right for them, which might live on any one of hundreds of different platforms that we all use in our organizations or in our local areas. So how do you kind of like make that work? And we've got time for that. That'd be a podcast episode in its own right. But Big Help Out's tried some
Yeah.
things, and it's taught us some things about what we can do to try and connect our systems up a little bit better at times when we
Mm.
really need them.
Mm.
And that's really attractive to someone like me, because I think it means everybody gets to keep their own platform, everybody gets choice. There's no monopolies in the market. Hopefully, no one system dominates, and whoever is leading these initiatives, whether it's a temporary campaign like Big Help Out, or or a kind of real civic or civil need, such as during COVID and it's government imposed, we're not having to follow one line. There's no one ring to rule them all. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We all get to sort of use our own platforms, but still connect together when it's advantageous to everyone. Digital offers us that kind of choice, but we still feel fairly early on in our adoption of those kinds of processes.
It's that passporting conundrum, isn't it?
A bit, yeah, a little bit. I'm increasingly coming to the view that you probably don't even have to call it a passport, because there's just lots of useful stuff that you do to create a passport that probably most volunteer managers would be interested in somewhere along the
Yeah.
line. Mm.
I think one of the other things for me that you've just hit on there, Gethyn, and I suppose this comes in your piece about developing a vision, but also some of the excellent work this toolkit does in trying to bring together some of the real great initiatives that are going on in the volunteering sector at the moment, like, time well spent, like vision for volunteering, like all of this kind of stuff. So kind of shout out that this toolkit brings all of that together in a really nice way, in a way that I haven't seen in too many of the places so far. But I suppose the other thing I wanted to talk about with visioning and sort of where you go with this kind of stuff, I think I'd be interested with digital as well, is I suppose the encouragement it potentially gives us to go and where we take our inspiration from as to like what good looks like and like what could be possible as well. And I think, for a long time, sort of, I think volunteering has looked at, probably the world of work, right? And took a lot of its inspiration from, how you design and create kind of good workplace experiences.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about digital is if we can draw inspiration from that as volunteer professionals that, starts to get us into some quite exciting places, I think, that move us away from the world of work and into sort of experiences more generally. So why should our volunteering not be more like Netflix, or not be more like Just Eat, or not be more like some of these kind of experiences, right? These seem to me the kind of experiences that we might want to lean into more in the future if we can, rather than leaning into what a good workplace looks like, and that's what it seems to me, which is what Time Well Spent is telling us, is that people don't want to volunteer in an experience that looks and feels a bit like work. They want to volunteer in an experience that's perhaps a bit more like Netflix, or perhaps a bit more like Just Eat, where you dip in and out of things. And digital seems to me to potentially be, if we can get confident in that could, and we can innovate in that space, and we can draw our inspiration from that space. That's how we can create experiences that are perhaps more genuinely flexible, that are more genuinely innovative, that are perhaps more genuinely in line with Time Well Spent or the vision for volunteering. I don't know if you've got any, thoughts on that, because it seems like the case studies in the report, that's what they're doing. I'm reading here about British Heart Foundation. They're attracting younger volunteers because they're embracing new digital approaches.
Yeah, and more flexibility. Absolutely, absolutely. And I don't think it's necessarily about replacing one with the other. I think there's a rebalancing going on. So I think workplace approaches to volunteering still have their place. There are definitely still volunteers out there that are cause driven and almost see themselves as deliverers of the vision or the ambitions of the charity, and want to feel an identity as part of the workforce there. I think anytime there's a big civic emergency, that kind of instinct in volunteers still raises up, and it's still a big part. We used to call these people the civic core, but it feels like they're the bit of the graphs that are really suffering, I suppose, post COVID. But at the same time, you've got this other angle on volunteering that's been in the ascendancy for the last few years or so, I suppose, and it's encouraging us, I think, as you're describing that, to take more person-centered, experiential approaches. Perhaps, we might even say treat the volunteer a bit more like a customer, so to speak. I don't necessarily think there's a trade-off between those two approaches. I think if they can mutually reinforce each other if you do them well. If you're a volunteer manager that starts from the perspective of, I really want to give my volunteer a brilliant experience, I still think you get to really good organizational outcomes at the end of that process. I just think you start from a different place. So there's something of a marketing influence that's coming into volunteering here, isn't there? It's about sort of customer segmentation, and rather than saying, right, we're going to bin off all workplace approaches and we're just going to go down the experiential route, I think kind of what's happening to us is that we've recognized that volunteering is in a really challenging era, and that we none of us really work in a world anymore where a one size fits all offer works for all of the volunteers that you might attract. And so we're all segmenting our audiences a little bit more and becoming a little bit more sophisticated about it, recognizing that for some people, experience and entry points are the really key things to get right if you're looking for a long-term sustained relationship and commitment with this individual, rather than just relying on the cause to do all of the selling for you. And digital doesn't change that perspective necessarily. It just says, well, here are some options if you're thinking about doing volunteering in these ways.
I think there's something in there for us, as volunteering professionals, commissioning the solution to this, to these challenges that we have, to be challenging the IT companies, the digital companies, to to say, well, actually, as you're developing your tools, we don't want you just to imagine a world of workforce planning solutions. We want you to borrow from Netflix, borrow from YouTube, or whatever it might be, and bring in that outside thinking from other customer journeys into our sector too. I guess we did a podcast about digital a while back, and one of the guys on there was saying it's quite hard to get people to invest in digital and volunteering because it's quite relatively a small market. But actually, I think
Okay.
we need to be demanding that actually, with all the AI and all the developments that are going on in the world, that we want to see that innovation, and there's a challenge for us as volunteering professionals. Sometimes I think you said it, Gethyn, to see the unknowns. We
Yes.
don't know what technology isn't doing for us. It takes a big leap of imagination to imagine what it can do. And when I've commissioned VMS systems before, I've come across that with volunteering teams, brilliant people, but they can't quite imagine what the technology can do, and sometimes the ITT team can't imagine what volunteering people want it to do, and you're left with big gaps. And I think one of our challenges really is to start to fire up that imagination, both internally but also with the IT companies, to say, actually, where can we take this journey? And actually, when I'm
Yeah.
commissioning a system, one of the questions I might be asking is this provider constantly innovating and driving their product forward? And I suppose that will be one of the other things I'd be looking for when I'm purchasing is, are they going to keep, is this a tool that's going to work for me today, or is it one that's going to grow with me as my volunteering experience grows?
Yes.
And I think, maybe we're into stage 2 and 3 of your toolkit, but we should dream big.
Yeah, no, we should. You're right, and we're customers in this as well, where those
Mm.
volunteering platform providers are concerned, and it's good to remind them that of it occasionally. I think there are two things that this toolkit does that will hopefully help with some of these challenges, I suppose. So the first one is around uh, how we can try and think like tech and digital companies to help us in volunteering. And we've picked up on this methodology around growth mindsets and growth loops
Mm.
that we see as prevalent in tech industries. And it's mostly about scale, it's mostly about growing audiences, but it's also about improving the experience for kind of digital customers as well. And the quickest way to explain growth loops, I suppose, is sort of, it's an alternative to the old sort of sales funnel idea. So if any of you have ever worked in sales or versions of sales, you're probably familiar with this really awful funnel thing where you spend an awful lot of time and activity and energy at the top of the funnel trying to generate about 1,000 leads in the hope that 10 of them turn into customers, right?
Mm.
So, and there's so much waste along the way of that. All of these people that are vaguely interested in what you're doing, that it kind of never goes anywhere.
Sounds like being
So
a consultant, Gethyn.
it does, exactly. It's when I started, that felt like kind of how you needed to do it. And actually, growth loops helps us a little bit with this as well, really, because what growth loops does is it encourages you not to think about the audience that you don't have, but to kind of obsess about your current audience and get them to help you find other people that will like it as well. So, and this isn't this isn't a flawless approach, I suppose, in volunteering, because we're also interested in things like diversity, and we tend to, know and approach people like ourselves, don't we? So not suggesting that growth loops is brilliant from a diversity perspective, but if you look at what tech industries have done, say when you join LinkedIn or something, for example, and the algorithm prompts you to think, would you like to sync this with your other contacts in your address book so that you can connect with them more easily on LinkedIn, and you say yes, please, and it does that for you at the back end, and then that generates more value for you, and it obviously generates value for LinkedIn as well. So there are these growth cycles, these continuous loops of value, which you can sort of base around bits of the user journey, and you look for aspects of that you can tweak and enhance and that you can measure. Crucially, measurement is a big thing about the success of these things, and that's where digital comes in, because digital can help us measure stuff automatically in a much easier way than having to go and ask your volunteers, have you told anyone about our program, and try and work out whether that's led to anything or not. So growth mindsets is one. The other thing that we are really keen to do as part of this toolkit is that as well as downloading the toolkit, which is completely free, by the way, I should have said that at the beginning, you can also join what we're calling a community of practice around digital, which is really just a simple way of bringing volunteer leaders and managers' voices together to try and amplify those so that they're strong and coherent with providers and with others in the digital space. It's a way of us kind of helping digital to evolve and develop on our terms, rather than, I'm not suggesting this is happening, but the developments in tech suggest that the latest technical developments are what drives the changes in the market rather than what we really need, what we really value. So it's an attempt to put us slightly back in control here. And we think that there are some good agendas coming next year around digital in volunteering that we can hopefully try and influence through this community.
Yeah, I have to get quite obsessed with the Silicon Valley kind of models, and
Yeah.
wondering how they transfer across into volunteering. And I think in this world is that kind of that concept of recombination of ideas. How you've got an idea works at British Red Cross, and you've got one that works to serve the children, and how do we bring them together, talk about them, build that community of practice such that we actually start to sort of say, oh, what if we put this one together with that one? What does it tell us, and where do we bring technology in, and we keep innovating and driving forward, hopefully with the tech companies as well. And I think that will be
Yes.
tremendously valuable, Gethyn.
I hope so. And you don't need to look far for examples of this in recent times. I mean, I don't suppose the people who developed and operated the Good Sam app thought going into COVID that might be quite revolutionary for volunteering, but it got repurposed, didn't it? That sort of emergency health response technology into something that could turn volunteering roles into small time bound tasks. And now lots of software providers, lots of volunteer management systems offer a version of that task based volunteering for companies that want to, or for organizations that want to chunk up their volunteering offer into those kinds of ways. So that's just one example, but I think you're right. There's probably a lot out there in current tech that just hasn't quite found its use case with us yet.
Because the temptation is to try and mimic or recreate non-tech solutions in tech for volunteering, and the real art form is going to be some of that, but it's actually going to be about using tech to reimagine volunteering, and that bit's a bit much harder.
And so sometimes you just need the idea to sort of open the door to a more fruitful conversation. I don't think we always need to go down this road. I was at a round table recently, and I just said something off the cuff. It's quite a glib remark, really, about how we needed a sort of Reddit for volunteering, like a wiki-based resource for all people's brilliant ideas. And the funders around the table loved that, because it's sort of it's short and sharp enough for them to be able to go back and have conversations with their colleagues about, well, what are you going to do? What might you invest in? And that's probably not going to go anywhere, but it might open the door to something a bit more interesting. And wider ideas out there in tech and digital can give us some exciting language to make progress of the kind that we would like, hopefully.
Great. Well, lots to look forward in part 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 by the sounds of it, Gethyn.
Made a run for our own backs here. Yeah, absolutely. 2 and 3. We're going to stick at 3 for the moment, we think.
Well, I mean, it's as I say, there's so much in there already. It's a really useful, practical, easy to understand and come to grips with tools. So, Gethyn and your colleagues, thank you so much on behalf of the sector for producing something like this. I'm having been involved in 1 or 2 of these with clients in recent years to try and find technical solutions. I know how complicated both the ascertaining the need, but also convincing the funders and the leaders is. So to have a toolkit to do that is going to be tremendously valuable. So thank you ever so much for putting the effort into that, and obviously thank you for coming along today. If people want to find out more about the toolkit, of course we'll be putting the links in the show notes so people can, so you don't have to read out the full www for us now. But if they want to get in touch with you or to hear more, how would they do that, Gethyn?
Thanks, Chris. So I'm Gethyn Williams, which is Gethyn. Williams is the normal way. You can find me at gethynwilliams.net. Gethyn Williams is all one word, or that spelling on LinkedIn as well. And if you want to just go straight to the toolkit, then as Chris said, it's available now from the Team Kinetic website and the Association of Volunteer Managers website. So you can Google those, and they'll come up really quickly.
Or use your favorite AI tool to find it for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. So yeah, thanks ever so much for coming on, Gethyn. I'll be interested to talk again perhaps when the next parts are out as well. And certainly if we don't, we'll certainly be featuring links to them, I'm sure, in future episodes so people can find them. And yeah, thanks for coming on and telling us all about it.
Thanks ever so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, Gethyn. Lovely to meet you. Well, Chris, another podcast finished. Great chat with Gethyn, and this digital toolkit, I'm sure, is going to be really, really useful for people in volunteering, and also I'm sure people in digital as well. If you're someone that's in digital and want to know more about volunteering and what challenges we're grappling with, have a look at this, and I'm sure if you're someone that's business designing digital solutions, you'll find this interesting too. What did I take away from today? So I think these 5 steps, I think, are something that's really, really important for all of us when we're thinking about a digital project. And I think for me, this idea of sort of having a vision, understanding the journey, are 2 key components of sort of volunteer leadership anyway, and they're the kinds of things that lots of us involved in leading volunteering are thinking about. But establishing a level of clarity, I think, that is going to help you to deliver on your digital initiatives is so important. And I think the tools in this toolkit and some of the advice from Gethyn, I think today, sort of really emphasizes the importance of that. So I think takeaways from me, if I'm embarking on a new digital project in the future, I'm going to work hard to make sure I really understand the vision, and I also really understand the journey we're trying to go on. And I thought this idea as well of the 3 things: are you trying to be more efficient, are you trying to scale, are you trying to improve the experience, or potentially something else? But I thought that was also something that's really key. Being clear on our purpose and what we're trying to achieve at the end of it is really going to help all of us there. Any takeaways from you, Chris, today?
Yeah, very similar, really. I enjoyed reading the toolkit, and I went to the webinar as it was launched as well. And I think it's, in his own words, it's kind of 101 for doing this. And maybe you and I have been around and done a few of these before, but I think it's a useful reminder and a focus point to say these are the key things that you need to consider. These are the key stages you need to build in, and I think for that there's some really sound, logical tips that anybody who's new to this especially would find really, really useful in putting that together. In our usual style, Matt, we pushed the boundaries a bit tonight probably, and Gethyn's probably thinking, well, we're pushing into levels 2, 3 and beyond, because that's the way we are in this podcast. We like to see pushing the boundaries and thinking what comes next. So there's a few things buzzing around in my brain, I suppose, in terms of takeaways, which may go beyond the toolkit as well, and things I'd like to see in the future stages, and I'm sure Gethyn has those in mind. But things like thinking about how we really involve the volunteers in that journey, and how we help volunteer, how we help managers really project manage change in implementing these kind of models, will be things maybe for the future I'd like to see. I'd like to hear more about how we can get some of these tech companies to really be on top of the game in terms of constant innovation. And to be fair, a lot of them already are. I think they're already in that zone, and that's really pleasing to see for me, because as I say, maybe 10, 15 years ago, that certainly wasn't the case. Now we've got some real good competition in the world of volunteer management tech who are pushing the boundaries. And I think as professionals, we need to keep working with them to keep pushing those boundaries. And as you hinted at, learning from the Netflix and the other solutions in perhaps other technologies, particularly around customer satisfaction and customer experience. work. So yeah, I suppose I'm inevitably moved on what's coming next. I'm very excited about that as well. And I thought there was one thing that we could perhaps take away as some inspiration for ourselves is the conversation around growth circles. Um, we're obviously really keen for more and more people to listen to the podcast and get to understand and to join in the shared learning that we try to put through the podcast. And hearing the talk about how existing customers can help leverage new businesses, I wondered whether there's an opportunity for us to ask out to our regular listeners if they like what they're hearing, to perhaps introduce the podcast to one of their friends, one of their colleagues, somebody who they think might be interested. And that way we get to get more people listening and share the conversation and share the learning and the community of practice of our own podcast as wide as possible. So yes, if you like what you're hearing, please do pass word on, and maybe we can reach new audiences.
Sounds great. And a final shout out while we're on the theme of communities for Gethyn's community of practice around digital in volunteering. I think that's a great initiative. Anything that exists to bring people together, to share ideas, to kind of influence change, to be the change in this space, I think is really exciting and help shape future tools and resources. So a final plug for that as well. So two takeaways for everyone else listening, which is one, help us with our growth circles. How can you share our podcast? And two, getting on board with that community of practice hopefully is something you might be interested in to help shape digital and volunteering even further. Absolutely. Well, that's it, I think, Chris. Another episode in the bag. There we go. Thank you for listening, everybody.
Thanks all. Bye.